The snow gently settled on the silent city, covering the streets with a soft blanket of whiteness. Dylan Wells sat in his living room, gazing at the Christmas tree adorned with bright lights that now seemed almost mocking. Christmas night, a time of miracles and family, but something in the air screamed that this night would be different. He hadn't expected to find an envelope under the door. He just noticed it when he returned home after a late call from the office. The faded yellow paper and his name, Dylan, written in uneven handwriting. No return address, no explanations. He picked it up without giving it much thought, but now, sitting in the silence of the night, he felt a strange heaviness from this simple object. Dylan, open this now, he whispered to himself, feeling the cold seeping through the window panes. His fingers froze on the edge of the envelope. Tearing it open meant letting in something that seemed to be lurking on the edge of his tranquility. When the paper finally gave way, he saw that inside were photographs. The first was blurry, as if taken in haste. In it, a woman was leaving a motel, her hair disheveled. He didn't know her, but the next photograph made his heart stop. In the image was Julia, his Julia, the one he had known and loved for 10 years. She was smiling, not the way she had smiled at him in recent months, but as if the whole world was embracing her. In the background, a man with his hand on her shoulder. There were more photographs, sharp, like a blade. Julia in a restaurant with the same man. Julia entering a hotel. Julia laughing as if she owned every moment of this foreign life. But that wasn't all. Under the photographs was a note, written in neat, clear handwriting. She thought I wouldn't find out. Now you know. Good luck, Dylan. He stared at these words for a long time. His mind worked slowly, refusing to accept what he saw. This could be a mistake. It had to be a mistake. But why then did everything within him scream that this was the truth? His phone vibrated. It was a text from Julia. Will you be late? I'm waiting for you. Merry Christmas, darling. Dylan looked at the screen, feeling everything inside him tighten. Her words were familiar, almost cozy, but now they seemed like a mockery. He didn't respond. Instead, his gaze fell back on the photographs. What was he supposed to do with this now? In the distance, the city continued to shimmer with lights, but for Dylan, Christmas was over. Dylan sat in the dark kitchen, mentally replaying every detail of the photographs, as if trying to solve a hidden riddle they held. His gaze unconsciously fell on the ring on his finger. The metal seemed heavier, as if it knew what was coming. The clock on the wall ticked too loudly. Each second rang in his ears, marking the time until the inevitable confrontation. His phone lay on the table in front of him, the screen dark. Julia's message still hung in the air, unanswered. He didn't know how much time had passed, maybe an hour, or maybe just a few minutes. But when he heard the sound of the front door opening, his heart stopped. Julia was back. Her steps were light, like those of a person with no secrets. This almost angered him. How could she enter the house so calmly, the house she had just destroyed? She appeared in the kitchen doorway, her face illuminated by the soft light from the hallway. She smiled, hugging herself against the cold. "You're not sleeping?" she asked, her voice ordinary, almost tender. Did something happen? Dylan silently looked at her. At that moment, he noticed the smallest details he had previously ignored. Her casually gathered hair, the too new scarf he hadn't seen before. She looked tired but content, as if she had just returned from a place where she was happy. "Something happened," he replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "We have something to talk about." Her eyebrows furrowed slightly, but she sat down across from him, folding her hands on the table. "You're scaring me," she said with a nervous laugh. "Something with work? Or with your family?" Dylan slowly pulled the envelope from his pocket. He placed it on the table between them, his gaze remaining on her. "Open it," he said quietly. Her hand hesitated for a moment, then reached for the envelope. She tore it open with a slight reluctance, and Dylan did not look away from her face, catching every micro-reaction. When she saw the photographs, her face paled. She tried to speak, but the words stuck in her throat. "Dylan, she began, but he interrupted her, his voice cold. "No need. Everything has already been said." She rubbed her forehead, as if trying to clear her thoughts. Her eyes were filled with panic, but even more with guilt. "It's not what you think," she said, her voice trembling. "Not what I think." He smirked, but without joy. "Then tell me, what is it? Because honestly, I don't even know who you are now." She stared at the photographs as if hoping they would disappear if she looked long enough. Then she looked up at him, and something in her eyes changed. It wasn't an attempt to deny, not despair, but a strange mix of regret and defiance. "Okay," she finally said, her voice firmer. "I'll explain." Dylan hadn't expected this. He had prepared for lies, justifications, attempts to squirm out, but not for her to start telling everything as it was. Her words were quiet but clear, as if she had rehearsed this speech in advance. "It started almost 2 years ago," she said, avoiding his gaze. "Back then, I felt like you were becoming distant. Everything was the same. Work, home, routine. You stopped noticing me." He wanted to interrupt, but her voice became sharper. "Wait, let me say it. I'm not justifying myself. I just want you to know how it happened." She talked about meeting a man at work, about the first conversations that seemed innocent. She talked about how he complimented her, which she hadn't heard in so long, how she felt needed. It wasn't a leap into the abyss, but a slow fall that she didn't even notice. "It wasn't about him, Dylan." Her voice became hoarse. "It was about how I felt, like I was alive again." He remained silent. Her words echoed in his head, but none of them could explain or justify what he saw in the photographs. "And what about me?" he finally asked. "Did you ever think about me? About what this would do to us?" Julia lowered her head, and her shoulders trembled. "I know I ruined everything," she whispered, "but I want to fix it. Dylan, please, give me a chance." But he couldn't give her an answer. Not now. The silence between them became dense, like concrete, and a thought was born in her heart. Wasn't it too late? Morning brought with it a cold light, and nothing seemed the same. Dylan stood by the kitchen window, watching as the gray clouds covered the sky. His coffee had grown cold, but he barely noticed. Thoughts of the previous night swirled in his head like a worn-out record. Julia was still at home. He heard her muffled footsteps upstairs, but he couldn't make himself go up. It seemed that any movement, any sound could shatter the fragile balance that kept them under one roof. Her words echoed in his head over and over. "It wasn't about him. It was about me." This explanation explained nothing. He thought of dozens of moments when he could have noticed something, could have stopped it earlier, but his mind kept returning to one truth. She made a choice, and that choice wasn't him. He sighed, set the cup on the table, and headed upstairs. The bedroom door was ajar. Dylan paused, not daring to enter, but a voice inside him pushed him forward. Julia sat on the edge of the bed, her face pale and tired. Her eyes, puffy from tears, met his gaze. She opened her mouth to say something, but he raised his hand, stopping her. "I need to understand something," he began. His voice was low but firm. "How long has this been going on? And how could you come home after—" He trailed off, unable to finish. Julia looked down, her fingers nervously twisting the edge of the blanket. 2 years, she said quietly. But it wasn't constant. These were moments, rare meetings. Dylan smirked, bitterly and without joy. Rare? Enough for a whole album of photographs. Her face contorted in pain, but she didn't respond. Her silence was more eloquent than any words. She knew that excuses were useless here. "And what about those things you did?" he continued, his voice growing louder. "Those things I asked you for years and you said they weren't for you. And suddenly they were for you, but only with him." Julia tried to find words, but they didn't come. In the end, she only whispered, "I can't explain. I know how it sounds, but it doesn't mean I didn't love you." He laughed, short and bitter. "Love? Love doesn't do these things, Julia. Love doesn't lie, doesn't cheat, doesn't destroy." She closed her face with her hands, but he continued, "I tried to be everything for you, worked late, built our home, did everything to make you happy. And you found what you were missing with someone else." His words were sharp, like blades, but inside he felt no relief, only emptiness. Dylan, she finally whispered, her voice trembling. I know I hurt you, but I want to fix it. I'm willing to do anything to regain your trust. He looked at her, but her words seemed empty. Trust was something that couldn't be restored with words or promises. It was like a mirror. Once broken, it could never be the same again. You want to fix it? He said, his voice icy. Then tell me one thing. Why wasn't I good enough? Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't look away. It's not like that. You were good, wonderful. It was me. I allowed myself to seek something I thought was missing, but that doesn't mean you weren't good enough. Then why, he insisted, why did you destroy everything we had? She remained silent, and he suddenly felt that he couldn't be in the same room with her. He turned and left, leaving her in silence. Later that evening, Dylan sat on a bench in the city park, watching as the thin branches of the trees swayed in the gusts of wind. The cold pierced him to the bone, but he barely noticed. His thoughts were consumed by the meeting with the lawyer scheduled for the next day. Divorce. This word sounded alien, as if it belonged to someone else, not him. He imagined himself signing papers, leaving behind not only Julia, but their entire life. All those years they spent together now seemed fragile, like glass shattered in an instant. His phone vibrated, pulling him out of deep thoughts. It was a message from Julia. I understand that you're angry, and you have every right to be, but please come home so we can talk. I need you. Dylan read the text several times but didn't respond. Words didn't matter. They couldn't fix what had been broken. He leaned back against the bench, closing his eyes. A memory surfaced from a day that now seemed part of another life. It was their first Christmas together. Julia stood in the kitchen, trying to bake a festive pie that looked more like chaos and dough. They both laughed as flour flew into the air, covering them from head to toe. She seemed so real, so genuine. Where had all that gone, he wondered. But something in that memory now seemed false. The same laughter, the same genuineness he saw in the photographs. She had given it to someone else. His thoughts were interrupted by a noise nearby. A young couple walked past holding hands. Their conversation was light, filled with laughter, and he involuntarily followed them with his gaze until they disappeared from view. Envy and pain flared in his chest. This was the life he thought he was building, but it was just an illusion. That evening he did return home. His steps echoed in the silence of the house. Julia sat in the living room, hugging a cup of hot tea. When she heard the sound of the door, her eyes met his, full of hope and fear. Thank you for coming, she said softly. He didn't respond, just sat on the other end of the sofa, maximally distancing himself from her. For a while they sat in silence, and only the ticking of the wall clock broke this oppressive silence. I want you to know, she began, but he raised his hand, stopping her. Not now, Julia, he said coldly. I'm tired of words. You had 2 years to say everything you needed to. Her face twitched, and she slowly nodded. I deserve this, she whispered, but I still have to try, because I know I'll lose you if I don't do something. He looked at her, and for the first time in all this time, there was no anger in his eyes, only emptiness. You've already lost me, he said quietly. You just haven't realized it yet. She closed her eyes and tears began to stream down her cheeks, but he felt nothing. No pity, no compassion, only endless loss. Late at night, lying alone on the sofa, he suddenly remembered his father's words, spoken to him in his youth. Trust is a bridge that can be destroyed with one wrong step. Rebuilding it is almost impossible. Now Dylan knew how that felt. His bridge had burned to the ground, leaving him on the lonely side of the river, with no way back. Dylan woke up on the sofa, wrapped in a blanket he must have pulled over himself in the depths of the night. His head pounded and his body ached from the uncomfortable position. Rays of morning sun filtered through the windows, illuminating the living room. It took him a few seconds to remember where he was and why. His gaze fell on the kitchen table, where the envelope with the photograph still lay. He wanted to throw it away, but something held him back. It was a reminder, a beacon of his disappointment and loss. He heard soft footsteps. Julia stood in the doorway, her face gaunt, her eyes red from tears. She looked as if she had barely slept. In her hands, she held 2 cups of coffee. "I made you coffee," she said, offering one of them. Dylan looked at the cup but didn't move. "No need, I can handle it myself." Her hands trembled and she carefully set the cup on the table next to him. "I know this is probably pointless, but I want to try to explain again," she began, her voice quiet but full of emotion. "Dylan, I know I betrayed you. I know I destroyed what we built, but I don't want this to be the end. I'm willing to fight for us." He looked up, and there was something sharp, almost painful in his eyes. "Fight for us?" he echoed. "Julia, do you understand what fighting means? It's not what you're doing now. Fighting is choosing to be honest, open, working on problems, not running to someone else. You chose the path of least resistance." Her face contorted in pain, but she didn't look away. "I know, but I want to fix it." Dylan laughed shortly and bitterly. "Fix it? How do you imagine that? We'll go back to what was. How do you think I can ever trust you again?" "I don't know," she admitted, "but I'm willing to try. I know it won't fix everything at once, but I want to show you that I can be different, that I'm still the one you loved." These words hurt more than he expected. She was right. He loved her, even now despite everything that had happened. But that love was poisoned by her actions. "Maybe you can change," and he said, looking away. "But I'm not sure I want to be around to see it." Her face froze, as if his words hit her harder than she expected. She tried to say something, but he raised his hand, stopping her. "I met with a lawyer," he continued. "I'm filing for divorce. This isn't a decision made on emotions. It's what I have to do to protect myself." Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't argue. Instead, she nodded slowly, as if her strength was leaving her. "I understand," she said, "but I'm not giving up. Even if you leave, I'll fight to show you that I can be better." He didn't respond. Instead, he stood up, took his cup of coffee from the table, and headed for the door. "Dylan," she called as he was already at the door. "I know I may have already lost you, but thank you for at least listening." He turned, looked at her one last time, and quietly said, "Listening and believing are not the same, Julia." The door closed behind him with a soft click. Her words still hung in the air, but he knew he could never be with her the way he was before. This chapter of their lives had come to an end. A month later, Dylan's life took on a new rhythm, though every morning he still felt a strange emptiness, as if waking up in someone else's home. He had moved into a small apartment on the outskirts of the city, taking only the essentials with him. Things that reminded him of Julia stayed in the house, as if he was trying to leave the past behind with them. The day of the divorce arrived faster than he expected. They met in the lawyer's office, avoiding each other's gazes. Julia looked pale and depressed, but Dylan remained detached. He could no longer allow her emotions to affect him. Signature after signature, and their union was officially dissolved. When it was all over, she tried to say something, but he raised his hand, stopping her. "Please don't," he said calmly. "It doesn't matter anymore." She nodded and tears began to stream down her cheeks, but he felt no relief, only a dull pain, like after a long and heavy illness. After the divorce, Dylan decided to focus entirely on himself. He returned to work with renewed vigor, started going to the gym, and on weekends he walked around the city, trying to rediscover the simple joys of life. But despite all his efforts, the wound was still there. It was deep, but now he began to believe it would heal. One of those weekends, he decided to go to an exhibition of local artists. Art had never been his passion, but he felt he needed to do something new to distract himself from his thoughts. At the exhibition, he stopped in front of one of the paintings. It was an abstract landscape, blurred lines, shades of blue and gray intertwining in chaotic harmony. Something in this painting resonated with his soul. "It reminds me of the silence after a storm," a voice sounded nearby. He turned and saw a woman standing next to him. Her hair was short and her eyes shone with a soft warmth. She smiled, noticing his confusion. "Sorry, I didn't mean to bother you," she added. "It's okay," he replied, returning the smile. "I was just lost in thought." "You're right, it does remind me of silence." The woman introduced herself as Rachel. They started talking, and the conversation was light, almost weightless. She said she was into photography, and the exhibition was her way to get inspired. Dylan felt unusually relaxed around her, as if someone had finally helped him remember what it was like to just be himself. When they left the gallery, Rachel asked, "Do you often go to such exhibitions?" "No, this is my first time," he admitted, "but maybe I'll start going more often now." She laughed, and he realized her laughter was bright and pure, without a hidden undertone. In the following weeks, their meetings became regular. Rachel didn't ask unnecessary questions about his past, and he didn't rush to share. Instead, they just were. She showed him how to see beauty in the little things, the reflection of light in a puddle after the rain, the texture of old wood on a park bench. Her presence was healing. One evening, as they sat in a small cafe, Rachel asked, "You look like someone who is starting to live again. Is that true?" Dylan paused. He looked at her face, at her sincerity, and realized that for the first time in a long time, he felt something akin to hope. "Yep," he replied. "I think so." She smiled, and he felt something inside him, something that had been broken for so long, finally beginning to mend. The past was still a part of him, but it no longer defined his life. He knew there would be challenges ahead, but he was ready for them. He had learned one thing. Even after the most destructive storm, there always comes a time when you can start rebuilding. And now Dylan was ready.